So as we saw last week, the dream that Daniel had in chapter 7 corresponds to the dream that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had recorded in chapter 2 of the book. Nebuchadnezzar had seen a progression of 4 empires from a human and earthly perspective. So he sees this towering image of a man made of 4 different metals. Well, Daniel in chapter 7 sees the same thing, but from a heavenly perspective. And so he sees not an image of a man made of 4 metals, he sees 4 beasts. In chapter 8, Daniel is given a more detailed vision of the second and third of those empires. And while chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic, you may remember when we were studying and we got to that place in chapter 2 where all of a sudden it switches from Hebrew to Aramaic. That goes all the way through chapter 7, the very end. But now that we're in chapter 8, it's back to Hebrew. So verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. So this takes place 2 years after the dream that Daniel had recounted in chapter 7. You may remember it starts out in the 1st year of King Belshazzar. So this is the 3rd year. So this takes place 2 years after that. Verse 2. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. So Shushan is the Hebrew name for the Persian capital of Susa, about 200 miles east of Babylon. So here's a map that gives you a little bit of the yellow region is the region of Elam. It's really to be associated later. It comes to be known as Persia, and you can see where Susa is, the capital of the empire at that point. So there he is. He says, the Persian king Xerxes built a magnificent palace there in Susa, a gorgeous facility. Here are the ruins. These are the ruins of that palace, and here is reconstruction based on those ruins of what they think Xerxes' palace looked like. This is, in this place, Susa, and in this palace is where the events of the book of Esther take place and where our friend Nehemiah served as the royal cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes. Now, Daniel didn't actually go there. He goes in the vision he's taken to this palace. God transports him there in his vision. At that time, the river Ulai flowed by Susa. Today, it has a new course, but in that day, it went actually right by the capital there. So, verse 3, then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. Now, verse 20, as we will see when we get there, identifies this ram as the Medo-Persians. Persia used the ram as their emblem, as kind of their mascot, if you will. Let me ask you, for those of you that are at all conversant in a little bit of history, we took a look at it last week. Can anybody think of what is the animal that's associated with Babylon? Anybody want to guess? The lion. The lion you remember the winged lion that he sees? The lion, it's a motif over all of their art. Well, in Persia, it was a ram. In fact, the Persian king, at this period in their history, didn't wear your typical crown that was a round thing. It was a kind of a tiara that had 2 horns on it, representing ram's horns. So he's kind of the chief ram, if you will. Daniel sees a ram with 2 horns, again identified in verse 20 as representing the kings of Media and Persia. Originally, in history, Media dominated their Persian neighbors, treating them as serfs. Jeff, my battery is down to 1 all of a sudden on this, so I don't know, it might be a little weak. So there's the region of Media, it's the blue at the top. They dominated their neighbors to the southeast, the Persians. But over time then, the Persians eventually reasserted themselves and became the lead of the two groups. When they did Cyrus was the first Persian emperor who led the resurgence of the Persians over the Medes. Here's what's interesting. Cyrus knew the history of his people, and he knew how the Medians had dominated them and made them vassals and made life very difficult for them. And during this time, Cyrus, who rises to lead the Persians so that they resurge and gain parity with the Medes, and then they actually conquer the Medes. If you can put a new one there, that'd be great. Cyrus had this brilliant idea of, listen, our people have been dominated by the Medians for decades. Why don't they treat us as equals? If they made us partners, it would actually make them stronger, and we could then enjoy the benefits. And so he got it in his mind, well, if the Persians ever conquer the Medians, that's what we'll do. We won't make the Medians serfs like they've treated us. What we'll do is we'll invite them and we'll say, hey, listen, why don't we be equals? And so that's what they did. And guess what happened? It made them now doubly strong because they had all the Medians that were supporting them and helping them rather than just serving as slaves, as serfs. And then they looked at their neighbors around them and they said, you know what, we're stronger than them. And they began extending their territory. And they did the same thing with all those they conquered as well. They said, listen, join us. We'll make you equal partners in the empire. So instead of just being our slaves, why don't you join our empire? And they did. And this is why the Medo-Persian Empire spread so rapidly. So Daniel sees two horns. The higher of the two came up after the first because it represents the Persians who rose to power after being dominated by the Medes. In the vision, the ram stands by a river. It pushed west, north, and south, crushing all opposition. But now it stands by this river. The idea is this: it's reached a boundary that it can't cross. And that's what happened. The Persians quickly defeated their Babylonian neighbors, then pressed west, north, and south. They took all of Mesopotamia, Syria, northwest Saudi Arabian Peninsula, Israel, and Egypt. I want to show you, there's about just shy of a half-minute little video that shows the expanse of their empire. So here we go. So there's the Median, the purple is the Median Empire. Here's the Persians. They take all of Anatolia. They spread down into the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. They take Israel. They spread all the way to the Ganges River in India. They take Egypt. So moving west, they took all of Anatolia, the area that we know today as the modern nation of Turkey, right up to the Aegean Sea. And that's where they ran into trouble. So in this vision that he has, the ram is stalled at this river, right? This body of water. Same thing happened with the Persians as they then come into this area where there were a number of Greek city-state, actually colonies. The Greeks over in Greece, their city-states, they had sailed across the Aegean Sea, had landed on the west coast of Anatolia, Asia Minor, and they had planted a bunch of colonies there. They did conquer that area, but in doing so, they inflamed the anger of the Greek city-states in mainland Greece. Up to that point, the Greek city-states were fractured and contentious, constantly vying with each other for the title of who the lead Greek city-state was going to be. And y'all know of this. Think about, in history, who were the two big Greek city-states that were always at war with each other? Athens and Sparta. Yeah. Classic, they were constantly at warring with each other. But now that the Persians come into the area, all of a sudden the Greek city-states go, okay, hold on, we have a much bigger threat now than each other. We need to unite to resist the Persians. And so that's, of course, what they did. So the Persians, then what they did, the Persians then came across the Aegean Sea up to the north part of Greece. They conquered that area, but they didn't leave any permanent settlements. The Persians just tried to keep control of things through bribes and alliances. The Persian threat moved the Greeks to unite. Now, it took a little while, but they finally started to work together to resist Persian influence in their region. And so we've heard of the stories of the battles between the Greek city-states and Persia, right? How many of you saw the movie 300? Okay. Classic war between the Greeks and the Persians. A battle of Marathon in 490 BC and Thermopylae, the hot gates. That's the battle there in the movie 300. That was in 480, 10 years after the Battle of Marathon. Now, in the Greco-Persian wars, they went back and forth. They really kind of fought to a stalemate. And it stayed that way until a Macedonian king by the name of Philip developed the Macedonian army into a superb fighting force and marched south to take the control of those Greek city-states. Philip was then assassinated as he prepared to move against the Persians in the east. And it fell to his son, and who's Philip's son? Alexander. Alexander the Great. Alexander then, it fell to him to carry on his father's vision. And that's who's represented in the next part of Daniel's vision. Look at verse 5. And I was considering, suddenly a male goat came, where? From the west, across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him. But he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. So, again, the Persian ram is stalled at the river. The idea is its authority can go no further. It was time for another kingdom to rise to supplant the Persians. And that kingdom is represented by the goat of verses 5 through 7. Verse 21 tells us that this goat represents the Greeks under the leadership of Alexander the Great, represented by that notable horn on the goat's head. And its swiftness links back, you might remember, to the third beast in chapter 7, which is represented by a leopard with 4 wings. Remember we talked about that last week? Leopard is very, very agile, very quick, but it has 4 wings on it. It's a picture of great swiftness. And here, this goat, notice it says, it moves so quickly, it's like it doesn't even touch the ground. It's like it's flying, it's that fast. Alexander took only 12 years to conquer the regions formerly ruled by Persia. 12 years. And even further east, all the way, even deeper into India. 12 years. They don't have trucks and jeeps. They don't have helicopters and airplanes. They have horses. In 12 years, he conquered all of that territory. And the goat is a fitting symbol for the Greeks because, like the ram for the Persians, it arises out of the mythologies of their origins. In Macedonian myth, their first king was led by goats to the place of their first city. Agai is the name of the city, which means goat city. As heir to the Macedonian throne, Alexander was tied to this goat mythology. In verse 7, the goat attacks the ram in great wrath. And history tells us that Alexander abhorred, he detested the Persians. And he believed that the gods had assigned him a divine mission to defeat them. He talks about this repeatedly, how much he hated the Persians and how he had a mission from God to bring an end to their empire. In 333 BC, Alexander defeated the Persians in the definitive battle at the Battle of Issus. And then 2 years later, the Greeks won again at the Battle of Gaugamela. That was the effective end of the Persians, who fled to their far eastern fortresses. And a year later, Alexander conquered all of Persia. Now, between the battles of Issus and Gaugamela, Alexander conquered all of the eastern Mediterranean and Egypt. A long siege of Tyre and the region of Gaza saw the people of Jerusalem open their gates to Alexander. Check this out. The Greeks never had to conquer Jerusalem because as they march down the coast and they start heading into Egypt, the people of Jerusalem, they know this prophecy. And so they countered as, listen, these people are here. This has been prophesied. These people are coming. And so they open their doors and they just say to the Greeks, we surrender. There's not going to be a battle. There was no siege. The Greeks never laid siege to Jerusalem because they surrendered to them. The Jewish priests read to Alexander the prophecy of Daniel. They read him this prophecy. They showed him how Daniel foretold the Greek victory over Persia and said, you are this notable horn on this goat. So verse 8, therefore the male goat grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn was what? Broken. And in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now, jump on down to verses 21 and 22 for the interpretation of this. And the male goat is the kingdom of, what? Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. So the broken horn represents the fall of the first king and the division of the Macedonian Greek Empire into 4 smaller kingdoms under 4 lesser rulers. And that is exactly what happened. Exactly. With Alexander's untimely death at 32 years of age, at the zenith, at the peak of his power, because he had made no provision for the peaceful passing of his rule to others, and he had no children, the empire was divided among his 4 main generals. And they then went out and took possession of what Alexander had conquered. Now, I know you're not taking notes or anything, but just follow along with me. So you have Seleucus, one of his, the yellow over here is what's called one of the generals, his name was Seleucus. This becomes the Seleucid Empire, and you can see how massive it is. You have the Ptolemies down in, one of his generals' names was Ptolemy. He takes possession of Egypt. And then you have Lysander, Lysimachus, sorry about Cassander he takes Greece, and Lysimachus takes Macedonia and Thrace, Cappadocia, those regions up there. And at first, Lysimachus had the western side of Anatolia. Seleucus eventually conquered all of that as well. He had all of Anatolia. So you can see that Seleucus, the Seleucid kingdom, was by far the biggest, and it was the richest, okay? The reason I'm mentioning that is because we're going to be taking a look at that guy in just a minute. But notice what Seleucus did. The Seleucids came down, and he wanted to conquer Egypt. Because Egypt was kind of historically, it was always the place that conquerors wanted to have. Why? Because of its ancient, rich history. And that's where all the food is, by the way. That's where all the food is grown, along the Nile. And so the Seleucids were constantly at war with the Ptolemies. And the Ptolemies wanted to open the roads up so that they could get trade up into this rich area up here. So where do they end up having their battles? Can anybody guess? In Israel. That's where they met. There was constantly, that area went constantly back and forth between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Okay, who's the most famous of the Ptolemaic rulers? You know her. You know her. Cleopatra. Cleopatra was a Ptolemy. She was a descendant of this general, Ptolemy. By the way, Ptolemy knew Herod the Great, Caesar, Mark Antony. She knew all those guys. So, yes, Israel ends up becoming the place where they have their big competition is right in that area. Now, with verse 9, the vision becomes a challenge to interpret. Verse 9, and out of one of them, and remember, we've just read about the 4 horns, right, that took over from the broken big horn. For out of one of them, that is the four horns, came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And what's the glorious land? It's Israel. It's Israel. Now, if you try to picture that, remember, he has a vision here. Now, if you're trying to vision that, that will just break your mind. We start with a notable horn on the goat, which is Alexander. It's broken, signifying his death and the shattering of his dominion. 4 horns come up in its place, separated into the north, south, east, and west. And from one of those comes a little horn that grows by expanding its territory where? South and east and toward Israel. That it grows south suggests that it lies to the north of what it tries to conquer towards. Now, how would you picture what Daniel saw as this horn grew like this? Now it's going to really get difficult to interpret. Look at verse 10. And it grew up to the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the places of his sanctuary was cast down. And the place. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth to the ground. He did all this and prospered. So are we looking at a good guy or a bad guy here? This is a really bad guy. Who is this? Is this someone who has already lived, or are we looking into the future as we read this? These are questions that have challenged Bible students for generations. Let's see if we can sort it out. First, we're confronted with another little horn. Didn't we already encounter a little horn? Remember that? Chapter 7. The 11th horn that rose in the midst of the 10 horns on the monstrous 4th beast of Daniel's dream. But we have a problem. This little horn, it connects to which beast? The 3rd beast, not the 4th beast. This 3rd beast represents Greece. The 3rd beast also in chapter 7, where the little horn connects to the 4th beast, which represents Rome. So this little horn is different from the little horn of chapter 7. What links them is their title. They're both little horns. Okay? You guys with me? They're both little horns. Now, as we've seen in our study last Wednesday and Sunday, in prophetic dreams and visions, horns represent what? What do they represent? Kings and kingdoms. Kings and rulers. So, who is this and what does all this mean? I don't know, let's go home. In chapter 7, who does the little horn represent? We looked at it Sunday. It represents the Antichrist, the ruler of the final world empire that Christ returns and puts an end to. This little horn comes from one of the 4 horns that represent the 4 divisions of Alexander's kingdom. So this is not the Antichrist. Although, would you agree with me, there's an intended connection to him by calling him the little horn. This one conquers nations to the south and east of his original position and then invades Israel. He attacks the Jews militarily and, did you notice, religiously. Because what does he do? He causes the daily sacrifices to stop. We see that in his attempt to destroy their faith by halting the temple service and even throwing over, it says, he throws truth to the ground. Look at what it says he'll do, verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation? Ooh. The giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. So Daniel overhears a conversation between a couple of angels. One asks another what the time frame is for all of this to be fulfilled. The little horn not only halts the daily sacrifices, he defiles the temple with a sacrilege that is so great, it's called the transgression of desolation. Does that sound at all familiar? Sounds a lot like the phrase abomination of desolation that we'll encounter in the next chapter. and that Jesus will quote as he's speaking about the end times in Matthew chapter 24 regarding the end times. So the answer to the angel's question of how long comes in verse 14. Here we go. And he said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Now, here we go. We have here an example of a place where in the translation to English, we have a problem. Because the word translated days here is literally in Hebrew, evenings, mornings. When does the Jewish day begin? When does it begin? At evening, when the sun sets. That's when the day begins. So typically if we talk about a day, we say morning and evening, right? Because for us it starts in the morning and goes to the evening. In the Jewish mind, if you say evening, morning, it's a day. You're talking about the beginning and end of a day. Got it? Okay, so days here is literally in Hebrew. It's not the word day in Hebrew. It's literally evenings, mornings. Because what's being referred to here is, what has he just been talking about? What will the little horn bring an end to? The daily sacrifices. How many sacrifices did the Jews conduct in their temple that were part of the daily regular routine? How many? 2. One in the evening and one in the morning. So it's 2,300 morning evenings. That translates into 1,150 days. You follow? Okay. So all we're doing here is, the reason it's stated this way in Hebrew is because we're talking about the sacrifices. And from a heavenly perspective, that's what's being looked at. That's what the concern is. How many sacrifices are going to be offered until they're stopped, you see. I realize this is a little complicated, but I know you guys are sharp and awake, sort of. So at the conclusion of that time, 1,150 days, the defiled sanctuary will be cleansed and restored to its rightful place in the nation's life. Now, history makes clear what all of this means and tells us who this little horn is. This is, and scholars are pretty much across the board agreed on who this guy is. This is a little horn that comes up out of one of these 4 horns, and he does something in the land of Israel that brings an end to the sacrifices in the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. This is Antiochus IV, known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He was the king of the Seleucid kingdom with its capital in Syria, one of the 4 Greek regions after Alexander. Antiochus did press his borders east into Persia, then south into Egypt. He made it all the way up to the border of Egypt. Lying between Syria and Egypt, of course, is Israel, which he invaded and he conquered. Antiochus was determined to stamp Greek culture and religion on the territories that he ruled. He considered the religion of Israel especially offensive and determined to bring an end to the belief in just one God. Alexander felt himself on a mission to not only destroy the Persians, but to bring the blessing of Greek culture and religion to the rest of the world. Well, Antiochus saw himself as kind of the heir to Alexander's vision and mission. And he was determined that he was going to make all of his domains Greek. Greek language, Greek religion, Greek practices. And so if there was any group of people on the planet that opposed Greek religion, it's the Jews. And he was determined to wipe out their religion. He forced the Jews to accept what he considered the superior religion and culture of Greece. Now remember, this was after the return of the Jews from exile in Babylon. And we've talked about this before. When the Jews came back from exile in Babylon, did they ever worship idols again? No, they were cured. They've been cured of idolatry ever since. I mean, Babylon cured them of idolatry. They came back, they were very careful to not make any graven images. You know, even the decorations of the temple were of such, they avoid creatures as much as possible. And we have trees and plants and so on, but we're going to try to stay away from anything that's living because we don't want to even hint that we're moving in the wrong direction of idolatry. This is where it was in captivity in Babylon that they returned to the Word of God, and teaching the Bible became so important, so that there are synagogues in every city where people can go to actually study the Bible, study God's Word, to make sure we never do what our ancestors did in turning away from God. This is why Jesus had such a difficult time with the Pharisees, because what were they so into? God's Word, but the traditions around God's Word. You see, they were so concerned about it, but their traditions about it and not actually what it said. And so here's these Jews now. They're back in the land. They have rebuilt their temple. They have their sacrifices going. And then this clown comes in and says, no more keeping the Sabbath. He outlawed the Sabbath. No more circumcising your kids. You can understand how the Jews felt about that, right? And then he comes into the temple and he says, all right, no more sacrifices. Antiochus set up a statue to Zeus in the temple, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar. So you understand what he's doing to the Jews. He's trying to provoke them, saying, I'm here, I'm in charge, you will do what I say. Antiochus was so enraged at the opposition that the Jews showed towards him, he decided to do something so heinous it would cause the Jews to either submit or break into outright rebellion so that he could massacre them. And that's when he then puts this statue of Zeus in there and sacrifices a pig on the altar. So imagine the reaction. The Jews were horrified, and they let the temple lay desolate until the Jewish patriot Judas Maccabeus rededicated and cleansed it. The number of days between the desecration and the rededication was, anybody want to guess? How many days? 1,150 days. Verse 15, then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. And so he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. So the angel Gabriel was sent to give Daniel an understanding of what he'd seen. Gabriel's glory was so great, Daniel was overwhelmed. Verse 18, now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and stood me upright. And he said, look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the later time of the indignation. For at the appointed time, the end shall be. I like this. I think Daniel's just kind of reporting, just what happened. It's this. He's seeing this vision. All of a sudden, Gabriel comes, and Gabriel's glory is so great. It's more than his humanity can deal with, and so he faints. And Gabriel comes and touches him and lifts him up and goes, look, I'm talking to you. Daniel's like, okay. I just love this little touch of kind of, Daniel saying, I was just overwhelmed by this, and he had to wake me up. The ram which you saw, having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. So Daniel has a vision of the future. It all came in symbols using animals. What was a vision of the future for Daniel in symbols is the facts and the characters of history for us. You see, he's seeing a vision of stuff and by symbols, but we look back. He's looking forward, we look back. And we read through the lens of history. The chronicle of history makes it clear these things came to pass in amazing accuracy as was foretold. Verse 23, and in the later time of their kingdom, this there is the 4 kings who arise out of Alexander's dominion. As the days of their dominion are winding down, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, that is when the seeds of corruption sown at the start of each of their reigns matures and bears its bitter fruit, a king shall arise, having, watch this, fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. Everything that's said about this guy makes him out to be supremely wicked and evil. The phrases translated fierce features and sinister schemes gives the picture of someone of supreme arrogance and conniving. This guy has a wicked plan that he discloses to no one because he trusts no one. And he trusts no one's because he himself is a consummate liar. Well, who does that sound like? Okay, so what do we know about this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes? Antiochus IV. History tells us that he was actually brilliant. This is not a dumb guy. He was brilliant. And he had a plan. But he didn't trust a soul. So even the people that were closest to him, he lied to. Because he didn't want to let anybody in on what his plans were. As a consequence, no one trusted him, and he trusted no one. Verse 24, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. The idea here is that of supernatural aid. And the question is the aid this guy receives divine or demonic? Well, it's clearly demonic because he's an evil dude. Does God permit him to do what he does, or does Satan empower him? And the answer is yes. Satan is empowering him, but Satan can't do anything that God doesn't allow him to do. In light of the evil that he does, he's inspired by the devil, but he could not do what he does apart from God allowing it. And the question we ask then, why does he? Because all of this sets the stage for the emergence of Rome to enter the area and lay the groundwork for the first century when Christ comes. All Satan does in playing his games by manipulating world affairs is weave the rope that will hang him. There's something else that God does in allowing this guy to get away with his wickedness that we'll see in a bit. We start to zero in on it now. Look at the last part of verse 24. He shall destroy fearfully and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. This passage is a maybe supreme example of how prophecy in the Bible is more than a foretelling and some one-time future fulfillment. This passage in particular brilliantly shows that we need to understand prophecy as a foretelling and an ultimate final fulfillment, but along the way there are pictures of what that final fulfillment will look like. Y'all follow me? This is a brilliant picture of this. Because note, this little horn that he originally sees is not the Antichrist. It's Antiochus IV. But guess what? Antiochus IV is a picture of the Antichrist. We can look back in history and look at this guy's career and say, that guy is a picture of what that guy will look like. Because God wants us to have an understanding of what the future will be. So he gives us little hints in history throughout time so that we get a growing picture and clarity. It's like you have a fuzzy image, and as time goes by, it sharpens. It gets sharper and sharper and sharper. The little horn here represents the Seleucid king, Antiochus IV, as I said, and lays down a pattern for how the Antichrist will conduct himself. Now, some background on Antiochus. He was the 9th ruler of the Seleucid Empire. He murdered his brother, who was the rightful heir to the throne, in 175 BC and seized power. In 170 BC, he invaded Egypt and defeated the Greek Ptolemaic Empire. On his return to Syria, he stopped in Jerusalem to quell a revolt and enacted a policy of enforcing Greek culture. The temple was desecrated. The treasury was plundered. Then, watch this now. In 68, Rome decided it was time to get involved in the area. The Egyptians had already asked for help against Antiochus. He was forced to withdraw, and he made Israel a buffer zone between his realm and Syria and now Roman-controlled Egypt. He knew the Jews hated him and would side with the Romans, and so he came up with a two-part plan. Bribe every influential Jew that he could find, convincing them to go Greek. And think about this. in Jesus' day, what's the name of the sect of Jews who are heavily influenced by Greek culture? What do we call them? Sadducees. Where do they start? Right here with this guy. Is it all starting to fall together for you? So that was his two-part plan. Number one, bribe every influential Jew that he could find, convincing them to go Greek. And number two, kill anyone that opposed him. The policy didn't work so well. He ended up burning Jerusalem and killing thousands. He forbade the Jews, again, just real quickly, keeping the Sabbath, having their annual feasts, prohibiting them circumcising their children. Altars to the Greek gods were set up. Jews were ordered to offer unclean sacrifices and eat pork or be killed. As his power began to slip away in the face of the Roman advance, Antiochus demanded that people call him Epiphanes, which means the manifest one. It's at this point he says, I'm God. Antiochus Epiphanes, the manifest one. The Jews called him Epimanes, which means the madman. Now, there's little doubt that Antiochus is in view in this prophecy. It's pretty clear. What's prophesied here was fulfilled by and through him, but only in part. There are elements of this prophecy that Antiochus came close to fulfilling but didn't complete. He was a brutal ruler who opposed God, elevated himself to the place of deity. He's a type of that last great world ruler, who, like Antiochus, elevates himself to deity. He will pass himself off as Christ, and that's why he's called the Antichrist. When you hear the word anti, don't you tend to think of against, right? But the main meaning of the Greek prefix, anti, doesn't mean against, it means instead of. That's the main meaning of the word, instead of. This chapter is crucial because it gives us a pattern to look for in the emergence and career of the Antichrist. Gabriel told Daniel in verse 17 that these things will take place when? In the later days, at the conclusion of history. As we study the career of Antiochus, we gain insights into the plans and policies of the Antichrist. And here are some of the things that we can glean. He achieves great power from others. Verse 24, it says, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. In other words, his power isn't because it's his by right. He usurps the power of others. Just as Antiochus murdered his brother and took his throne, the Antichrist will gain his position by intrigue and subterfuge. We saw that in chapter 7 with his emergence as it deposes 3 of the other kings who try to oppose him. It also points to his being demonically influenced. Revelation suggests that it's at the midpoint of the tribulation that Satan himself will possess the Antichrist. Second, his reign is marked by massive deceit. In verse 25, through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. He shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. His rise to power is marked by deception because he's an agent of Satan. And what did Jesus call Satan? The father of lies. He'll use deceit because he himself is deceived, thinking that he's a god. This was Antiochus. He made promises and kept none of them. History tells us that Antiochus made it look like he was doing good for someone when in fact he was setting them up the whole time just so that he could dispense with them, get rid of them. Didn't anybody here, do you remember when you were in college reading The Prince by Machiavelli? Do you remember that book? Not many, okay. Raise your hand if you're right. Okay, is that right? Okay, so you've all heard the term Machiavellian, right? It means to, it's for the realm of politics, it's the idea that the ends justify the means. And it doesn't matter what you do, as long as you get what it is that you're hoping for. Morality doesn't matter in politics if you're Machiavellian. All that matters is getting done what you want to accomplish. So lie, cheat, steal, whatever. It doesn't matter. If there was anybody in history that was Machiavellian, it was Antiochus IV. And that will be the Antichrist. As long as he gets his way, anything is worth doing. The ultimate pragmatist. And don't we already see this in politics today? I mean, and really, this is the direction that we're seeing. Politics has been hollowed out. There's no morality. There's no ethics. You have an objective. It doesn't matter what you do to get it. Just get it done. Unfortunately, too many people are willing to let their politicians that are, giving them what they're promising get away with it. There's a joke. You guys have heard the joke, right? How do you know a politician is lying? His lips are moving. When I was in school, virtue was honored, and the American founding fathers were examples of it. George Washington was a paragon of honesty. The whole story of the axe and the cherry tree, right? Recently, we've had presidents who were known liars, but they were popular because of the agenda that they promoted. It seems that people don't mind being lied to if they like what's being offered. As the consummate man without God, the Antichrist will offer people the ultimate deception. And what's the ultimate deception? That you are a God. And they'll buy it, hook, line, and sinker. Take note of that phrase. It says, he will destroy many in their prosperity. There is in italics, supplied by translators to smooth out the English. Here, I think it more obscures it than smooths it out. He shall destroy many in prosperity. Prosperity, that word is a special word that points to a condition of peace and safety that allows people to prosper. At first, Antiochus sent messages offering the Jewish leaders the proverbial olive branch of peace. He passed himself off as a powerful friend wanting to honor them and strike an accord of mutual friendship. It was all a ruse to get them off guard, failing to prepare for his takeover. He sends messages before he comes. I'm going to come in peace, and I want to have a friendly relationship with you. The Jews never prepared, and he brings in his armies, and he goes, okay, I'm here, and I'm in charge, and you will do what I say. The Antichrist is going to do the same thing. He'll appeal to the desire for peace, making promises about how tolerant he'll be. He'll hold forth the promise of great prosperity for all who join his new political, economic, and religious system until he has the reins of power, and then he moves to get rid of any and all opposition by any means. We see the danger of an unreasoned longing for peace in the West posture towards the Iranian nuclear program. I do not understand. Listen, I'm not being political. I'm just talking about what's happening in current events, okay? The Iranians, the leaders of the Iranian Republic have made it clear that it is their intention to destroy the big and the little Satan, meaning the United States and Israel. They've made it very clear. They've made public statements that they are pledged to the destruction of the United States and Israel. And their nuclear program is not aimed at producing nuclear energy. It's aimed at producing a nuclear weapon because it's their intent to use it to destroy who they said they will destroy. The West hears that, our diplomats hear that, and they say, oh, come on, they're just talking to their radical base. They don't really mean it. Let's remove the sanctions. We just gave the Iranians $6 billion, didn't give them $6 billion. We took the sanctions off of holding $6 billion so that we could get hostages back. When you give money to someone to give you a hostage back, what does that encourage? More hostages. It's like the brain cells are dying in the diplomats. The Iranians have told us they want to destroy us. They have proven their willingness to fund terrorism around the world right now. They're backing Hezbollah in Lebanon. But we want peace. We want peace. We want peace. But they don't. Oh boy. Number 3, he will be intelligent and persuasive. Verse 23 says, he understands sinister schemes. Antiochus was extremely good at playing the political and diplomatic game. He managed to keep those that he wanted to defeat constantly off balance. He shook hands with his right hand while holding a dagger in his left. And people kept falling for his deceits, though they ought to have known better. The Antichrist will make Antiochus look like an amateur. Number 4, he'll subjugate Israel to his authority, as did Antiochus. We read about that. That's why he's called the Antichrist, the instead of Christ. At first, the Jews will assume that he is in fact their Messiah because of what he promises them. That's in verse 24. In verse 25, he'll rise up in opposition to God. And then in number 6, his rule will be terminated by divine judgment. In verse 25, it says, he shall be broken without human means. Antiochus died mysteriously in Persia in 163 BC. The doctors could not figure out what was wrong with him. They do not know what he died from. They attributed it to, you ready for this? Depression. They say he died of depression. He just gave up. The Antichrist will be defeated by the return of Christ. Antiochus IV fulfilled this passage in amazing detail. The Antichrist will lift that fulfillment to a whole new level. Revelation 13 says that the Antichrist will be a man possessed by Satan himself. For the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, he's simply a man of amazing power and intelligence who seems to have the answers for problems that confront the world. His promise of peace and prosperity are so appealing, and he's such an astute political operative. The entire world is won over. But once he's firmly in power, having gotten there by conspiracy and deceit, he'll take the gloves off, removes the mask, and begins to make demands. The Jews will realize that he's not their Messiah. He'll bring the daily sacrifices which have been restored in the rebuilt temple to an end. And as Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 2, he'll enter the Holy of Holies, declare himself God, and demand that the world worship him. At that point, the Jews will realize that they've been duped. The man's a demon. They'll reject him, but he'll be too firmly entrenched in power, and he will attack furiously. As he moves to expand his sphere of control to the entire world, the remaining nations that have eluded his grasp will unite to attack him and his armies. And they meet in the valley of Jezreel, and what's known as the Battle of Armageddon. And it's in the midst of that battle that Jesus returns, and the nations that have gathered there to war against each other will unite to try to stop him. And here's how it ends. Toast. It's just done. Jesus isn't going to come and, wade into battle. He just speaks. Done. It's over. Go God. Antichrist and his chief lieutenant are captured. They're bound, thrown into the lake of fire. And there you have a thumbnail sketch of the end of history up to the return of Christ. Now, notice Daniel's reaction to the vision, verse 27, as we wrap it up. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward, I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. The sheer scope of the vision that Daniel was given overwhelmed him. Now, he says no one understood it. And it's easy to understand why. Why? Because he's looking at something in the future. We can look back and understand it, especially because Gabriel told him who these two beasts represent, the Medo-Persians and Greece. It's spelled out right there, you see. So we can look back on history and we don't say, well, who is this? I wonder who this is. We read who it is. But if you don't know and you're looking forward, you're looking at the future, and what you've seen are these symbols, can you understand why Daniel is seeing and he's hearing things that he's just overwhelmed by, literally overwhelmed? He's earthly, he's human, he's flesh and bone, and he's having the veil that separates the physical from the spiritual removed, and he's just overwhelmed. What happens when people see an angel? What happens to them? They're on their face. So many people say, I'd love to see an angel. No, you wouldn't. You really wouldn't. Unless they were in that mode where they're, kind of shielding their glory. You wouldn't want to see an angel in his glory. You'd be undone. It would be too much for you. So that's his position. It was so intense that it drained him. It's possible as well that he catches some images of some of the things that Antiochus and the Antichrist will do, and it distressed him. Imagine Daniel as he's there, in Babylon, seeing this vision, seeing the altar in Jerusalem with pig's blood on it. I mean, what would that do? That would be really difficult for a man like Daniel. He concludes by saying that he was astonished by the vision. No one could understand it. I'm thankful the Bible gives us an inkling of what the last days will be like. God inspired such prophetic passages so that you and I would be reminded that He is the Lord of history. He's sovereign over the nations. Even a ruler like Antiochus or the Antichrist can only rise because God lets them. And the end isn't one of ruin. It's not the destruction and desolation that the Antichrist brings. Let's never forget that the end is the glorious return of Jesus Christ in His reign for 1,000 years. And then an eternity of glory. So evil will have its say, but it doesn't have the last word. Again, our God has the last word.